Welcome, everyone. I think we're just giving a couple more minutes as people find their way back into the Zoom room. In the meantime, as you can see on the screen, we are asking that you just take a moment and reflect on the idea of what does culture mean? Welcome to the breakout session for incorporating cultural humility, cultivating context and respect. I'm very excited to be one of the organizers of this session. My name is April Oppoliner, and I am a project lead at Harvard X under VPAL.
And I'm Sejal Vashi. I'm one of the other organizers, and I am the manager of learning design and instructional support at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. It is a mouthful.
So before we get started, we're just going to go over a couple of session norms. As indicated during registration, this session will be recorded. We prefer to have everyone on camera so we can see you, but we also completely understand if you prefer to have it off. We're asking that you type all the questions into the general chat. There will be a Q&A session at the end, and these will be collected throughout the session, and we'll revisit this list at that point. And finally, if you can please stay muted upon entry and only unmute yourself if you're called upon to speak to the group. We're going to start with a little bit of a background to the concept of cultural humility before learning about various classroom examples of bringing cultural humility into teaching. There will be a small breakout activity, and then we will circle back to that Q&A before we close.
And so with that, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Shingleton, who's going to be our moderator for the rest of the session. So Rebecca is a lecturer in clinical psychology and is also a clinical psychologist. And just a brief story real quick. So when we were organizing this conference, I was like, who can teach me about cultural humility? And I came across Rebecca's course on cultural and individual diversity. And not only does she explicitly call out cultural humility, she does it on day one. And so I was like, I have to meet this person. So we have a session, we meet, it's wonderful. And I basically said, can you repeat everything you just said to about 100 people in a month and a half? And so luckily she said yes and has agreed to be a moderator. So I will pass it off to Rebecca.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to HILT and our organizers and panelists. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. I hope everyone's had a moment just to briefly reflect on this question, what does culture mean? We were meeting as a panel about a week ago, and we discussed how there are just so many different layers to culture. We can think about culture as our history, as our values, our belief system, sometimes more concretely like laws or customs, or more vaguely like traditions. One fluid definition that came up was the quiet knowledge used to interpret, experience, and engage in the world. And another was the unwritten rules that help us predict how someone will react. We discussed how culture bounds can vary and how we all have multiple identities: race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, disability status, socioeconomic status, education level, where we live in Massachusetts, where we live in the US, in the globe. The list goes on and on of factors that shape our culture. So while there's so many ways we can think about culture, there are a few unifying pieces that we can think about with culture. First, there is no one definition, and it's multifaceted. It takes in lots of different components about who we are, and it really impacts how we view the world, ourselves, and others. This multidimensional concept of culture is really important for today's discussion, focusing on cultural humility. Before diving into cultural humility, I'm going to very briefly discuss the concept of cultural competence, which laid the foundation for cultural humility. So cultural competence or multicultural competence was a pivotal and is a critical concept that was developed for multiple sectors: education, public health, medicine, clinical psychology. And it's really has some core components. One being developing our own self-awareness, our own awareness of our identities and the limits of our knowledge. This self-awareness highlights that each and every one of us has a culture, and that culture matters, and it impacts who we are and our relationship to others. Engaging in this self-reflection allows us to consider how our background and culture impacts how we think, how we behave and feel, and it also helps us recognize where there may be points of connection and disconnection with those who we're interacting with. It also extends to gathering information about others so that we can really do our best to engage with individuals from different backgrounds in a respectful and appropriate way. This includes understanding their background and what individual aspects play an important role in their own culture and how that's presenting in your current interaction. By developing this working knowledge, we can then focus on building skills to work with each other. A very basic example would be if I am strongly embedded in an individualistic culture and my student is from a collectivistic culture, what skills do I need to appropriately interact and engage with this student? Some critics of cultural competence have suggested that it's a bit check the box like if I learn X, Y, and Z, then I will be competent, and that is that. This I am culturally competent stance also implies that one can actually be incompetent. But what we really know is that we can never be competent in another culture. Relatedly, some people may shy away from approaching cultural competence for fear of actually looking incompetent. That is not socially desirable. Finally, others have suggested that it's really focused on the doing and skills. So again, I'll give a clinical psychology example. I need to develop specific skills and a working knowledge when treating certain culturally bound symptoms or syndromes. And it is critical, and we cannot deny that these skills and actions are very important to develop, but we may be missing sort of a process piece. And this is where the framework of cultural humility comes in. So before we dive into cultural humility, let's just do a brief anonymous poll about our knowledge of cultural humility. Okay, excellent. So we've got a nice range. About 70% of us know about cultural humility and are 30% of us are pretty familiar with the concept, and about 70 of us are familiar, but really only because of the session title. So we've got a nice range here. So I'm hoping that we can level the playing field on what cultural humility is, and then of course hear these examples from our panelists. So what is cultural humility? First, we can think of it as a way of being as opposed to a way of doing. It's really a stance that we hold and an approach. It's not a box that we check. It's characterized by being open and engaged in a process of growth and learning when working with others. Specifically, it's characterized by recognizing our own limitations and areas of growth. We cannot be experts in other people's cultures or their experience. Rather, we want to be curious about them, about who they are, and we want to strive to be open to what they have to say and acknowledge that there are many valid ways of viewing the world. It's really the opposite of my way or the highway. It's what we can call sort of an other-oriented stance. We can also think about cultural humility as having both intra and interpersonal components. Intrapersonal components include first, knowledge of your own cultural identity. Again, very similar to the competence component that I spoke about before. We want to understand our own history, our own background, age, sex, race, gender, education level, all these different components. And then we also want to understand how our own identity plays out in our relationships, how our identity intersects with others via privilege, power, equity, the fact that we do not exist in a vacuum, and these things play out in our interactions. And then the third intrapersonal component is a reflective component when we are actually interacting with others, recognizing what happened when I said this, how did somebody else react, or how did I react? So really being reflective of our interactions. The interpersonal piece is focused on being curious about others and their experiences, who they are, what they believe, how they learn, and so on. What I find particularly powerful about these aspects is that it takes away this competent, incompetent concern. We can't be an expert, so there's no expectation to act or look like an expert. Rather, we need to be driven by curiosity about those around us to teach us about themselves. Now, I want to be very sensitive about this point, because that does not mean that we are complacent and just rely on others to sort of show us the way. Rather, it's about being proactive in our curiosity in order to obtain the information by actively listening and seeking out knowledge, whether that's seeking out knowledge through books, through others, through your students, through your peers, and then again, engaging in the reflection process. It also offers more space for intersectionality, the fact that one individual has many identities that interact. So what I mean by this is it's not like, okay, this person is from XYZ background, so I will use these specific skills. Rather, it's more holistic in approaching the person as a whole and their multiple identities, as well as being open to hearing about their own experience, which again is likely impacted by who they are and their various facets of their background. Cultural humility also emphasizes being comfortable with discussing differences, that you can approach these topics with ease. For many of us, thinking about and considering individual differences like race, gender, sexuality, all these factors that I've already mentioned and more, the list goes on, can be very challenging and anxiety provoking. And so developing an ease around these topics is critical. And I think particularly critical for the classroom, where we want to model productive conversations with those who are different from us. So I like to think of this as a lifelong practice. We want to interrogate our assumptions. We want to acknowledge and be open to other viewpoints and recognize we will never be experts. We are not experts. And that's sort of one of the beautiful things about cultural humility. I find the concept of a compass particularly powerful when I think about cultural humility. So let's say I want to go east. Great. I start walking from Boston. I hit P-Town, then I somehow walk on the Atlantic Ocean. I hit Europe, I hit Russia, China, the Pacific, head into California, and I'm back in Boston. That is a lot of east. The most important point, though, is that I never ever reach east. It's simply a direction that I walk. Cultural humility is similar. We never obtain or reach cultural humility. Rather, it is a direction that we walk. Indeed, we have to take actionable steps like reflecting on our identities, actively listening to those around us, addressing our biases, and by taking those steps, we will move east in the direction of cultural humility. So why does it matter? Why move east in this direction? I'm going to be very brief here because our panelists are really going to show us. But in brief, as educators, we want to engage every student in our community. And cultural humility may be one path towards improved engagement because it offers a way for us to check some of our own biases and be open to reducing barriers to learning. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful set of panelists. We have Jocelyn Chu, who is the Director of Community Engaged Learning at the Harvard School of Public Health, who co-teaches with Rashawn Knowles, Director of Community Engagement, also at the Harvard School of Public Health. So I'm going to hand it over to Jocelyn and Rashawn, who again will show us their classroom experience.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks everybody for attending this session. Thanks to HILT for extending this invitation just to share about the course that Rashawn and I co-teach. I feel like I am here listening and learning as well, along with the panelists. And Rebecca, your introduction and your just the framing of cultural humility really sets the stage for us as we talk about our course. You mentioned it as a sort of a direction going east. And it definitely, I think about that it is a journey. And I think that that's something that we signal to the students, a journey, or what we'd like to call a practice. Thinking about one's own yoga practice, I will never be able to get to the perfect crow, but I continue to work on it, think about what I do. So it is, whether it's heading east, whether it's a journey, whether it's a practice, it is this ongoing cycle. And I wanted to just open up this time just to talk a little bit about our course, first of all, and why it gives us sort of an entry point into signaling or teaching or the practice of cultural humility. So Rashawn and I teach community-based participatory research, at the School of Public Health. It could turn up in other schools as participatory action research or action research. It is a participatory method of engagement. And it is what we want at the outset of how we frame the course is it's an approach to research. So you can actually run a clinical trial, or you can be doing stakeholder interviews using a participatory research approach. It's not necessarily a method, it's not quantitative, nor is it just qualitative. It is an approach to research. One thing that we define for the students is also that it's a research approach that equitably involves all partners in the process. And it has a tradition of roots in focusing on and calling out social injustices and leveling and challenging power imbalances. So CBPR itself gave us that opportunity to demonstrate, to signal what it is to be a culturally humble researcher or practitioner. So I do also want to say that the course itself is while we don't have necessarily any readings on and explicitly call out cultural humility, it does give us an opportunity to cultivate that through the way that we interact as a teaching team, from establishing our classroom culture itself, the assignments that are designed around reflections, and the guests that we bring into the room. And Rashawn will be speaking and sharing more about sort of more the how. But I did want to just note before I pass it over to Rashawn that the practice of public health at its core is about public engagement and action for public good. And so it actually behooves us to engage with a diverse set of stakeholders, with residents, with informal or formal leaders. So while public health education aspires to this, we find that it can fall short, because at an academic setting, we're also teaching the research. We're in a system, an industry that is producing knowledge and doing research. And so as we try to, so in classroom discussions, think about the practice of public health and think about sort of the practice of public health research. In that vein, then, we ask about sort of whose questions matter. Is it the investigator, or how is it co-designed and collaboratively emergent from the community? How do we define or actually redefine what knowledge is? We talk a lot about that sort of knowledge production. And then we find that students are actually reevaluating their sense of what is objective, what makes rigorous research, and why does it have to, why does objectivity have to stay sort of distinct and apart from being sort of engaged and in the field, and actually bringing oneself into that, into the sense making. So with that, I know we don't have a lot of time, and I'm going to pass it over to Rashawn to share a little bit more about the how.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you for all the folks who organized the session and who are here with us today, and for allowing me to be in this space with you all. And as Jocelyn said, it's funny because when Rebecca gave her introduction and conceptual understanding of cultural humility, Jocelyn and I were saying cultural humility is not something we explicitly name within our course, but when we thought about it, we realized this was a value that we carry throughout our work. And so I'm going to explain a little bit of how we incorporate cultural humility within our course. And a lot of it starts with the classroom culture and the environment that you want to create. So this starts with our teaching team. We try to create an atmosphere that is co-learning. As our class teaches both theory and practice, our students engage or will engage with culturally distinct populations and communities, many of which they do not self-identify with. So what we do is explicitly name race, gender, and other salient identities that we carry into our classroom. As a teaching team, including our TAs, we inherited this class from a previous instructor, and we realized that we had to interrogate the curriculum design, which we had inherited. Even with the selection of our TAs, we seek folks not only who have previously taken the course, but have demonstrated a strong commitment to working in communities and understanding of the structural inequities that exist and how our identities intersect with the system. This includes racism, gender, sexual orientation, immigration status, socioeconomic status, and things we seldom think of, such as family structure. Often, we find ourselves in public health working with underserved and vulnerable populations, so we really want to emphasize the importance of carrying this cultural humility within our research and practice. And as a teaching staff, Jocelyn and I, we actually discussed and agreed upon our conceptual definitions of community engaged learning, of our course objectives, of our personal journeys to academia, and how our identities shape our approach and understanding of our collective work in pedagogy. This includes our values, our understanding of one another's applied lenses, and an awareness of our areas of needed growth. We walk into this space fully aware that we are only experts in our lived experiences. We are intentional with creating a community of co-learning where each person is invited to be their authentic selves and bring their unique experiences and expertise into our classroom space, so even us as teachers can learn from our students in a multi-directional manner. We have built into our schedule a mid-course check-in so we can incorporate real-time feedback and adapt our course accordingly to student needs. We also strive to value and uplift different ways of knowing and being. We do this through our course materials. We analyze the syllabus, and we're intentional about having the voices of historically marginalized scholars included in our reading materials, our cited materials, and the quotes we use in our course. This, of course, includes women and scholars of color. We have been conscious of bringing in different sources of knowledge, and not only in the written word, we've included oral histories, music, poetry, and non-academic writings. We've included art and film. We've also embraced the value of uplifting interdisciplinary approaches to our work, whether it's in education, social work, in the legal realm. But we also do this to challenge the dominant ideologies that exist and introduce students to critical theories and non-dominant paradigms. And we like to have a people-centered approach. And what I mean by that is using the terms that people use to refer to themselves, their personal narratives, their realities, and their experiences across cultures, and really being mindful of how we socially categorize people. Are we saying terms like Asian when we really should be talking about Vietnamese, Korean, or Cambodian? Do we refer to people as poor when we really should use terms like living in poverty or under-resourced? We also are very intentional about who we invite in our class as guest speakers. And for us, this is important that our invited speakers are centered as experts in their own work, and we attempt to bring in a diverse group of individuals who work as researchers and practitioners in different capacities, and hopefully centering their narratives and personal expertise. For example, in our course last year, we had a trans sex worker who was doing a community-based research project. We've had Indigenous public health practitioners. We've had a Black environmental justice researcher. We've had folks working in global health and local Bostonians, including our community elders and residents. And most importantly, we start I think our first assignment is an assignment on critical reflection, where we have students create a statement of positionality. Now, we believe it is important for students to critically reflect on how they enter into their work, being aware of their personal social identities, including the dynamics of power, privilege, and oppression, and really taking time to think about how these identities impact their work? What questions do they ask? What are the values and ideology that they embrace? And how does this impact the work that we're going to do while we're engaging with our community? So we have students write a brief positionality statement. It's about 300 to 350 words. We don't grade folks' statements of positionality. This is rather a reflective assignment that really gets them to think about their identities in different cultures and how their values may contrast with the values of others, and how we may have to unpackage and unlearn some things that we thought was right, and we really realized that we didn't know as much about the world and other people as we were led to believe. And the last thing I'll leave with this statement of positionality, we really want to emphasize to folks that this is a working and living document, that your positionality will evolve as you evolve as a scholar, as a practitioner, as a person, as you engage with diverse populations, as you hone that cultural humility, that how you see yourself in the world will also evolve. And we like to emphasize that consistent reflection and really, embrace that different is good. What we know is not the only source of knowledge. What we think is not the only way of doing, and that we are better practitioners and researchers when we can embrace the different ways of being and knowledge sources that exist.
Thanks, everyone. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and break everyone out into breakout rooms of about 3 participants each. It's going to be automatic. You might be with people who you've never met before, so make sure you introduce yourselves, say where you're from, get to know each other a little bit. And then we have 3 questions posed for you. First is, what jumped out to you from the presentations? So just take a minute to kind of process everything you heard. Second is, what is one thing you are already doing in your classroom to incorporate cultural humility? And Jocelyn and Rashawn's intro was kind of the reason why we wanted to add this in, is they didn't specify the term cultural humility, but they were already doing the work. So we have a feeling that there are many of you out there who are already doing the work, but may not have realized it. And then the third is, what's one thing you want to try in your classroom to incorporate cultural humility? So you might not have done it before, but you're like, I want to see how this goes. And then there is a link to a form, and I'm going to put all of this in the chat as well. So what that form is it just includes questions 2 and 3. It's completely anonymous, but we're trying to essentially crowdsource ideas of how to incorporate cultural humility. So we'll take all the things that folks are willing to put in for questions 2 and 3, and then provide that as a resource at some point, probably next week. So anything you're willing to add about things you're already doing that others can learn from, or things that you want to try and others might also be wanting to try. So maybe we could see if there are resources we can provide for that. So I'm going to put that in the chat. And then you will have 15 minutes, and we'll make sure to bring everyone back for our Q&A section. So welcome back, everyone. We hope you had great discussions, and we hope you were able to fill out some of the forms so we have good ideas to share with others. We're going to go ahead and transition into Q&A, and you are a very quiet group that didn't want to post questions in the chat. So we're just going to open it up completely. If you want to use, you can use either the chat or the virtual hand raise function, and you can ask your question live. If you want to post in the chat, one of us will read it for you, but ask away and Rebecca will help moderate.
Gabe Abrams.
Hi. I first wanted to just say thank you to all of you for providing such inspirational and actionable stories and examples. So thank you. We in our breakout group, we just jumped straight in because we're all so excited and ready to discuss. And I was just wondering if you might have some thoughts on a question that we were discussing, which was not on the list of questions. But one thing that we were discussing was, when you're discussing some sort of content, whether it's a case study, whether it's something you're reading or researching, and maybe before we might think that someone's cultural identities, whether that's race, gender, sexuality. We might have thought that those weren't part of the discussion because it wasn't immediately relevant to that case, to that story, to that research. We were just discussing how do you handle walking the fine line between potentially including and referring to people's identities, even if maybe not everyone agrees that they're relevant, potentially bringing in identities that some people feel like shouldn't be part of the conversation because we intentionally don't want them to feel like we're making them feel relevant, whether, and the other side of that, walking that line, which is wanting to include these important cultural identities because we might discover through the discussion that they actually are relevant and they have some sort of statement on like power or I don't know. Basically, any thoughts on this question of like, do we bring up cultural identities in contexts where a lot of people might just assume that they're not relevant?
Rashawn or Salma, do either want to jump in?
Yeah, I could jump in. I think it's a very good question, Gabe. And I think in many ways, folks that assume that identity doesn't matter are normally part of the dominant identities anyways, and that's why they don't think that it matters. But I think it's creating from the get-go the space that we are gonna create an atmosphere where identity does matter and allowing students to express that, giving space for that if it is brought up. I think sometimes as teachers, our lack of familiarity or discomfort with discussing race, discussing cultural differences causes us to kind of deflect those types of comments. And so I think being open to it, I know Jocelyn and I, a lot of times we say, I don't know, like you tell me, like, why is this relevant? And can others share from your experiences why this should be relevant or just the different lens that someone of a different identity may be looking at the very same situation. I think that's one way of doing it. The other is being explicit about it and finding those examples. I know I was tasked, and I got some pushback from this, but the case studies that we use at the Harvard School of Public Health, they are identity neutral. You know, it doesn't mention race, it doesn't mention gender. And my idea is like, why not? Like that's the reality of the world that we work in. Why can't we include that and be explicit and intentional about our discussions? So as an instructor and as a teacher, I think you do have that opportunity, even if it's not written into a case, but bringing in, you know, elements of identity, bringing in different viewpoints, bringing in different cultures to say this is part of the work, you know, and I think that's the most important thing. And as we try to emphasize throughout the talking points that there is discomfort, you know, there's so many topics that come up and I'm like, whew, I don't have the answer for that. But I also know that somebody in this space might, and I'll ask them, can you give some thoughts and insights about this experience that we could all learn from?
Thank you for that. We have a follow-up question related to Gabe's. Thank you, Gabe, from Salma Abdu Ayash. We have the same question. And the second part is, how do you start to incorporate cultural humility as a course goal in terms of design, collaboration, co-learning, et cetera, in fields like science and engineering that should lend themselves to such a goal, given that these are some of the biggest influencers in the development of a human race? And there's a caveat that there could be a whole panel on this, which is totally right, but a wonderful question and extension of Gabe's.
I'll take a stab at this. So someone who actually is not from those kinds of fields, and it seems a little, definitely quite foreign to me, because as I was saying, in public health, there is sort of this natural tendency to think about engagement. But I'm wondering if these courses in the fields of science, engineering, what one might call sort of like the hard sciences, if there are ways, whether it is going out into what we call going into the field, taking so that the learning doesn't happen just in the classroom, but that it happens outside of that. And apologies that I'm not sure if I'm even hitting those right notes for you, but I think about visiting or bringing folks in. It is to start to think about, and I think the other ways of practice, other ways of knowledge production. I mean, I think that's what I lean on, and it was such a almost this epiphany when we landed on that in our course, to appreciate, to uplift other ways of knowing. And please respond, because I'm not even sure if that can be relevant in engineering. And I assume so, in terms of thinking about design and things like that.
Yeah, I think this is a great point. It made me reflect on one course where the project that was involved in the course involved going into high schools, that under resourced high schools, and teaching them physics concepts and resources that Harvard has. It's still enabling students' learning. It's a project where they have to come up with the actual learning goals, etc. But it's also exposing them to their own privilege as students who have access to this knowledge. Appreciate that comment. That's definitely, and I would love to hear from other panelists on ideas of how to incorporate that. Thank you.
And maybe something we do in our class where we may not have the answer to this question. So someone that's a participant may have a better answer, as this may be in your area of knowledge and expertise.
I'm also not in the hard sciences, and in psychology, it's sort of like an easy fit. But one idea that comes to mind is, and I think this sort of dovetails off of Jocelyn's idea of incorporating concrete examples where sort of non-dominant concepts really shaped important concepts, just sort of highlighting that and making that to recognize, like, we really need to learn. We can't just assume this is the way, and this one way of doing it is the right way, and thinking about other ways of thinking about it from non-dominant cultures. Angela.
Yeah, I was just going to highlight, so I'm an associate professor in systems biology at Harvard Medical School, so I am in the natural sciences, and I'm also the founding faculty director of the Scientific Citizenship Initiative, which Rashawn is helping us with as well. And our goal is exactly this sort of, how do we think about training scientists with a different model for leadership and communication and ethics. So I wanted to speak to this question of a lens that you can use to bring those concepts into a natural sciences classroom. And one of the most fruitful that we've tried so far is thinking about the governance or implementation of technology. Right? So you have a technology, it's going to go out into the real world, and then you can think about it from a variety of different stakeholder viewpoints and really talk about how important it is to both then have the self-awareness to think about what perspective are you bringing to analyzing that problem, and then also think about potential perspectives from other stakeholders if they're not in the room. So I think there's a lot to explore here. I think it's sort of an emerging way of thinking about how to bring some of these competencies to the natural sciences, but I do think there are ways, and I would be happy to talk more, Salma, if there are more points of connection.
Wonderful. I am mindful of the time. The Q&A has flown by. I'm going to hand it off back to Sejal to wrap us up today. And thank you for these wonderful questions and responses.
Thank you all so much. We just want to provide a few references and resources right here, but after the conference, you will get an email from HILT with a link to additional resources, likely next week. And anything that you put into the form of ideas that you're trying, we'll provide that as well. And then just a reminder that there is part 2 of the concurrent sessions starting at 1 o'clock. So you have these 2 wonderful sessions, experiential learning, the power of authentic learning challenges, and interdisciplinary approaches to addressing real-world problems. So you should have the links already in the email that you got earlier this morning. And with that, and a minute early, we would like to thank you. So on behalf of all of the panelists and moderators, thank you so much for attending, and we hope you enjoy the rest of today's session.